In criminal court, slang functions as testimony, evidence, motive, intent, or identity. This terminology appears throughout high-stakes judicial environments: police interrogations, jail calls, witness testimony, probation violations, and prison medical evaluations. It defines the record in arraignments, preliminary examinations, drug cases, gang-related cases, and sentencing hearings. The core operational problem for the legal interpreter is literal translation. Translating street jargon word for word destroys the context and renders sworn testimony nonsensical to the judge and jury. Consider the phrase, drop a dime. A literal translation into Spanish, dejar caer una moneda de 10 centavos, shatters the logic of the sentence. It produces confusion on the record instead of evidence. A contextual rendering preserves the actual meaning. In context, drop a dime means to inform the police. Accurate Spanish renderings include delatar, soplar información, or informar a la policía. The legal interpreter operates under an uncompromising ethical mandate. You must preserve meaning, tone, register, emotion, and intent. You may never sanitize, soften, exaggerate, or censor the speaker's language. Failing to provide contextual equivalence results in an inaccurate evidentiary record. We will now analyze the terminology of cooperation. Term: snitch, meaning in plain English, an informant, suggested Spanish interpretation. Sapo, informante. Courtroom context: cross-examinations attacking witness credibility. Example: are you a snitch? Becomes, ¿es usted un sapo? Term: rat, meaning in plain English, a co-conspirator who betrays the group. Suggested Spanish interpretation: sapo, delator. Courtroom context: gang retaliation testimonies. Example: he is a known rat. Becomes, él es un conocido delator. Term: drop a dime, meaning in plain English, to inform authorities. Suggested Spanish interpretation: delatar, soplar información. Courtroom context: wiretap transcripts. Example: I know he dropped a dime. Becomes, sé que él sopló información. Term: roll over, meaning in plain English, to cooperate with the prosecution against co-defendants. Suggested Spanish interpretation: cooperar con la fiscalía, delatar. Courtroom context: plea agreement negotiations. Example: they want him to roll over. Becomes, quieren que coopere con la fiscalía. Term: flip, meaning in plain English, to change allegiance and cooperate. Suggested Spanish interpretation: cooperar, cambiar de bando, convertirse en informante. Courtroom context: establishing motive. Example: the detective made him flip. Becomes, el detective hizo que cambiara de bando. Term: take the fall, meaning in plain English, to accept legal penalty for someone else. Suggested Spanish interpretation: cargar con la culpa, pagar los platos rotos. Courtroom context: organized crime or conspiracy cases. I won't take the fall for you. Becomes, no voy a cargar con la culpa por ti. This cooperation terminology establishes the foundation of motive and liability during plea agreements and witness cross-examinations. Accurate interpretation allows the court to correctly assess the relationships between co-defendants. The following terms cover the journey through the arrest system. Term: popped, meaning in plain English, arrested or caught. Suggested Spanish interpretation: arrestado, atrapado. Courtroom context: arrest narratives on the stand. Example: I got popped yesterday. Becomes, fui arrestado ayer. Term: booked, meaning in plain English, processed into the jail system. Suggested Spanish interpretation: procesado, ingresado en la cárcel. Courtroom context: arraignments. Example: he was booked at midnight. Becomes, fue ingresado en la cárcel a la medianoche. Term: holding cell, meaning in plain English, temporary detention area. Suggested Spanish interpretation: celda de detención temporal. Courtroom context: custodial incident reports. Example: we waited in the holding cell. Becomes, esperamos en la celda de detención temporal. Term: county jail, meaning in plain English, local incarceration facility. Suggested Spanish interpretation: cárcel del condado. Courtroom context: custody credit hearings. Example: he is in county jail. Becomes, él está en la cárcel del condado. Term: DOC, meaning in plain English, Department of Corrections. Suggested Spanish interpretation, Departamento Correccional. Courtroom context, state sentencing. Example, remanded to the DOC becomes remitido al Departamento Correccional. Term, Fed time, meaning in plain English, a federal prison sentence. Suggested Spanish interpretation, condena federal. Courtroom context, sentencing threat assessments. Example, you are looking at Fed time becomes te enfrentas a una condena federal. Term, throw the book at someone, meaning in plain English, to apply the maximum legal penalty. Suggested Spanish interpretation, aplicar todo el peso de la ley. Courtroom context, prosecutorial intent discussions. Example, the judge will throw the book at him becomes el juez le aplicará todo el peso de la ley. Misinterpreting custody jargon alters the court's understanding of a defendant's criminal history or current incarceration status. Precision in these renderings ensures the narrative context of the defendant's detention is accurately reflected on the record. Correctional facilities operate on a specific internal vernacular. Term, contraband, meaning in plain English, prohibited items inside a facility. Suggested Spanish interpretation, contrabando or artículos prohibidos. Correctional context, disciplinary hearings. Example, they found contraband in his cell becomes encontraron artículos prohibidos en su celda. Term, shank, meaning in plain English, a homemade weapon. Suggested Spanish interpretation, arma hechiza, chuzo. Correctional context, assault in custody reports. Example, he hid the shank becomes escondió el chuzo. Term, kite, meaning in plain English, a clandestine written message. Suggested Spanish interpretation, mensaje clandestino. Correctional context, intercepted jail communications. Example, pass this kite to block 4 becomes pasa este mensaje clandestino al bloque 4. Lockdown, meaning in plain English, total facility confinement. Suggested Spanish interpretation, encierro total, confinamiento. Correctional context, institutional status updates. Example, the prison is on lockdown becomes la prisión está en encierro total. Prison economics and violence rely on this coded language. Accurate interpretation of these terms is essential for maintaining a clear record during facility incident testimonies. Street terminology related to the drug trade and violent acts requires exact precision. Term, dope, meaning in plain English, drugs, often referring to heroin. Suggested Spanish interpretation, droga o heroína. Courtroom context, undercover narcotic buys. Example, I bought some dope becomes compré droga. Term, weed, meaning in plain English, marijuana. Suggested Spanish interpretation, marihuana o hierba. Courtroom context, possession charges. Example, he had weed in his pocket becomes tenía hierba en su bolsillo. Term, coke, meaning in plain English, cocaine. Suggested Spanish interpretation, cocaína. Courtroom context, trafficking cases. Example, they run a meth lab becomes manejan un laboratorio de metanfetamina. Term, meth, meaning in plain English, methamphetamine. Suggested Spanish interpretation, metanfetamina. Courtroom context, manufacturing cases. Example, they run a meth lab becomes manejan un laboratorio de metanfetamina. Term, smoked, meaning in plain English, consumed marijuana. Suggested Spanish interpretation, consumió marihuana, fumó marihuana. Courtroom context, DUI evaluations. Example, we smoked before driving becomes fumamos marihuana antes de conducir. Term, high, meaning in plain English, intoxicated or under the influence. Suggested Spanish interpretation, drogado, bajo los efectos. Courtroom context, medical capacity evaluations. Example, I was too high becomes estaba demasiado drogado. Term, plug, meaning in plain English, a drug supplier or contact. Suggested Spanish interpretation, proveedor de droga, contacto. Courtroom context, source interrogations. Example, call the plug becomes llama al proveedor de droga. Term stash, meaning in plain English, a hiding place or hidden supply. Suggested Spanish interpretation, escondite, alijo. Courtroom context, search warrant executions. Example, where is the stash becomes ¿Dónde está el alijo? Term burner, meaning in plain English, an untraceable or disposable firearm. Suggested Spanish interpretation, pistola, arma de fuego. Courtroom context, weapons charges. Example, I need a burner becomes necesito una pistola. Term piece, meaning in plain English, a firearm. Suggested Spanish interpretation, arma de fuego. Courtroom context, street encounter descriptions. Example, he carried a piece becomes llevaba un arma de fuego. Term hit, meaning in plain English, a targeted attack or assassination. Suggested Spanish interpretation, ataque, golpe, asesinato por encargo. Courtroom context, gang indictments. Example, they ordered a hit becomes ordenaron un asesinato por encargo. Term set up, meaning in plain English, an ambush or entrapment. Suggested Spanish interpretation, tender una trampa, preparar una emboscada. Courtroom context, informant testimony. Example, it was a setup becomes fue una trampa. Term hitting a lick, meaning in plain English, committing a robbery. Suggested Spanish interpretation, cometer un robo. Courtroom context, juvenile preliminary exams. Example, we were hitting a lick becomes íbamos a cometer un robo. Narcotics and violence terminology establish the legal elements of a crime. Softening these terms obscures the record of the speaker's intent. Interpreters face a specific ethical trap, over-explaining cultural terms mid-history of the shoe brand. You must maintain the exact register and keep the proceeding moving. Term Jordans, meaning in plain English, Jordan brand sneakers. Suggested Spanish interpretation, mis Jordan, mis tenis Jordan, or mis zapatos deportivos Jordan. Courtroom context, victim testimony regarding stolen property. Example, he stole my Jordans becomes se robó mis tenis Jordan. Term Benjamins, meaning in plain English, $100 bills.
Billetes de $100, dinero. Courtroom context, establishing financial motive. Example, it's all about the Benjamins becomes todo se trata de los billetes de $100. Term paper, meaning in plain English, money. Suggested Spanish interpretation, dinero. Courtroom context, narcotic sales transcripts. Example, we are making paper becomes estamos haciendo dinero. Term bands, meaning in plain English, thousands of dollars. Suggested Spanish interpretation, miles de dólares. Courtroom context, wiretaps. Example, I have 2 bands becomes tengo 2 miles de dólares. Term ride, meaning in plain English, a vehicle. Suggested Spanish interpretation, carro, vehículo. Courtroom context, traffic stop narratives. Example, step out of the ride becomes salga del vehículo. Term whip, meaning in plain English, a vehicle. Suggested Spanish interpretation, carro, vehículo. Courtroom context, drive-by descriptions. Example, he drove a black whip becomes manejaba un carro negro. Term crib, meaning in plain English, a home or apartment. Suggested Spanish interpretation, casa, apartamento. Courtroom context, probation compliance checks. Example, let's go back to my crib becomes regresemos a mi casa. Term biddy, meaning in plain English, a girl or lover. Suggested Spanish interpretation, chica, amante, jevita. Courtroom context, domestic contexts. Example, that's my biddy becomes esa es mi jevita. Term boo-boo, meaning in plain English, a girlfriend or partner. Suggested Spanish interpretation, novia, pareja. Courtroom context, domestic violence testimonies. Example, I was with my boo-boo becomes estaba con mi novia. Term shorty, meaning in plain English,
a young woman. Suggested Spanish interpretation, muchacha, chica. Courtroom context, witness identifications. Example, some shorty saw it, becomes una muchacha lo vio. Term, hooked up. Meaning in plain English, romantically or sexually involved. Suggested Spanish interpretation, conectado, involucrado románticamente. Courtroom context, alibi establishments. Example, we hooked up becomes estuvimos involucrados románticamente. Term, homie. Meaning in plain English, a friend. Suggested Spanish interpretation, amigo, pana. Courtroom context, establishing gang associations. Example, he's my homie becomes él es mi pana. Term, fresh fade. Meaning in plain English, a recent haircut. Suggested Spanish interpretation, corte de cabello recién hecho. Courtroom context, suspect descriptions. Example, he had a fresh fade becomes tenía un corte de cabello recién hecho. Term, ops. Meaning in plain English, rivals or enemies. Suggested Spanish interpretation, rivales, enemigos. Courtroom context, gang retaliations. Example, watch out for the ops becomes cuidado con los rivales. Term, cops/50. Meaning in plain English, police. Police. Courtroom context, fleeing and eluding narratives. Example, 50 is here becomes la policía está aquí. Term, sus. Meaning in plain English, suspicious. Suggested Spanish interpretation, sospechoso. Courtroom context, Terry stop justifications. Example, he looked sus becomes se veía sospechoso. Term, roll up. Meaning in plain English, to arrive or appear. Suggested Spanish interpretation, llegar, aparecer. Courtroom context, incident timelines. Example, they rolled up fast becomes llegaron rápido. Term, flex. Meaning in plain English, to show off. Suggested Spanish interpretation, presumir. Courtroom context, altercation motives. Example, he was trying to flex becomes estaba intentando presumir. Markers of identity, status, and wealth provide the context for gang affiliation and personal motive. The interpreter must keep the speaker's unvarnished social reality completely intact for the jury. Effective legal interpretation requires a rigorous understanding of the subcultures generating the language. Contextual equivalence is the only legitimate method to preserve the integrity of the source text on the legal record. To master this standard, Legal Interpretation in the U.S. Courts, a beginner's guide to navigating language, law, and ethics, is a foundational resource. It prepares professionals entering criminal law environments to interpret these complex terminologies with exact linguistic fidelity.